Kate Cowan. I'm a lecturer in education at the University of Sheffield and also an honorary senior research fellow at IOE, which is UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. My background is actually in teaching. I used to teach children aged 3 and 4 years old in a children's centre in England. But over the last 10 years, I've been researching children's play and communication from a multimodal perspective, which is what I'll explain a bit about. And I suppose I'm particularly interested in how the digital is increasingly central to many children's lives now and how it's part of contemporary play and communication practices. So some of the recent projects that I've been involved with have included the Play Observatory, which was a collaboration between UCL and the University of Sheffield that ran from 2020 to 2022. And that project was looking at children's play experiences during the pandemic. So including sort of shifts to online play, play through Zoom calls, that sort of thing, as well as a wide selection of play practices and adaptations to play practices. And we've been working with the Young V&A Museum to create an archive, a collection, an online exhibition of those examples that were shared with us through by parents and families during that time. And also a little while ago, I was involved in a project called Playing the Archive, which ran from 2017 to 2019, which was another collaboration between UCL and University of Sheffield. And that was looking at children's contemporary play practices and exploring continuities and discontinuities with play of the past through looking at archives of play created throughout the 20th century. So kind of in both of those projects and in all of my work, really, I've been interested, I guess, in children and young people's digital practices, which has included things like internet use, video games, social media, and so on, kind of as part of a changing landscape of play and communication. I mainly draw on multimodal social semiotics in my work, which is a perspective that was developed by Gunter Kress, who I was very fortunate to have known and worked alongside at UCL. And I suppose essentially social semiotics is about the creation and use of signs. So the kind of signs that we use in society and the social dimensions of how we make meaning. And it builds on Michael Halliday's concepts of language as social semiotic, emphasising the relationship between language and its social uses. So within a social semiotic approach, signs aren't seen as sort of fixed or arbitrary, but they're seen as being shaped through social and cultural and historical influences. And so sign making is seen as a kind of active process that gives insights into a sign maker's interests. And then since the kind of 1990s onwards, a multimodal social semiotic approach has developed, which has tried to kind of examine meaning making in multiple modes, not only language. So moving from that idea of language as social semiotic to kind of thinking about all the various different modes that are involved in communication. So that might then include things like image, moving image, music, gesture, facial expression, body movement, gaze, and so on, kind of in addition to, or sometimes also in the absence of, linguistic modes like speech and writing. And multimodal approaches are interested in the affordances of each mode. So what kinds of meaning making does each mode make possible or constrain? And also the idea of kind of transduction, which is the moving from one mode to another. So there's always going to be kind of gains and losses entailed in making a choice to move from one mode to another, and multimodality is sort of interested in that phenomenon, that effect. And it kind of would, multimodal approaches would kind of say that communication has always been multimodal. If we sort of think like way back to kind of cave paintings or medieval manuscripts, there's often combinations there of image and writing and colour and all sorts. But recent changes in communication, I suppose, brought about especially by the digital, have kind of necessitated theories that can account for texts and practices that aren't primarily language-based or also solely language-based. So thinking about things like websites, video games, films, cartoons, vlogs, and so on. These are all really complex multimodal compositions that might combine things like music, graphics, colour, font, sound effects, layout, and so on. So in the past, I guess, distinct disciplines have focused on particular modes, like musicology for music or gesture studies for gesture, but that kind of overlooks the way that they work together within an ensemble. So a multimodal approach offers a means of trying to look at these multiple modes within one theoretical and conceptual frame, and also without hierarchy. So it wouldn't use terms like verbal and non-verbal or paralinguistic or paratextual, those sorts of things, because they tend to privilege language and position other modes kind of just in relation to them. So multimodality has kind of become a particularly popular perspective for use in relation to research on communication in the digital age. And it aligns well with sort of new theories of literacy, like new literacy studies and digital literacies, by offering a kind of theoretical approach that accounts for that range of contemporary practices and texts beyond language. In some of his writing, Good to Crest talked about sort of entering a new age of communication that he kind of called a new age of hieroglyphics, almost. So like where the image, the visual modes are being put right to the forefront in a way that we haven't seen. It's a sort of new shift that we need to take account of. We need to pay attention to and develop theories and tools and methods and means for accounting for. And I think what's really interesting about things like TikTok as well in children's lives is that they're not just receiving this media, they're not just consuming it or reading it, they're often actively producing this as well. And so they're having to make choices in the text, the clips that they're making for TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, those sorts of things. They're making decisions about what modes they use together and how they edit, whether they use a soundtrack, whether they overlay text, in what color, how big, and so on. So absolutely kind of not just multimodal receiving of text, but also multimodal creation of text, I suppose, is something that's going on definitely in these kind of platforms. Multimodal perspectives have been used to understand communication in a really wide range of contexts, like hospitals, museums, shops, all sorts, so on. But I guess I've mainly focused on educational contexts, the early years classroom, and then increasingly recently as well, looking at school playground and home environments too, kind of as important sites where children are engaging in play practices and also learning is happening. So one of the ways that I've used it, for instance, in the Play in the Archive project, we were working with children as co-researchers, and they were helping us to document, to capture the play that was happening in the playground. And one of the things that we became very interested in was clapping games that they were showing us. And there were sort of, there was one version that they called Lemonade that followed a sort of, that many children throughout the playground knew, and they would routinely do it. But then we also kind of saw adaptations of this where they were sort of remixing this traditional clapping rhyme in their own ways, and they were adding references to things like Snapchat and Bluetooth and SpongeBob SquarePants and all sorts of kind of new media references were getting remixed in with this older traditional rhyme that they knew. And so one of the ways that I used multimodality for that was to sort of help me to transcribe and pay attention not only to the interesting things that were happening with language and being remade, but also the gestures. So the sort of the hand claps, the turning their full body, the gestures and so on. And we could actually see them when I sort of marked them onto a transcript using sort of symbols to denote, as well as the written and spoken communication. Was able to sort of see patterns in the clapping. So that actually there was quite a lot in the clapping rhythm and repetition that was staying the same, where they were sort of riffing on top of it with these other references quite playfully. So that was one way that I sort of used multimodal analysis and the theories of multimodality kind of in my work quite recently. And I suppose despite the kind of differing contexts, multimodality has always sort of been a theoretical underpinning for me that I think is helpful to sort of give my work coherence. So even though I might be looking at different settings, that's sort of the lens that I tend to apply, and those core principles can then be sort of applied in different social settings and scenarios. And quite a lot of my work as well has focused on the kinds of methodologies that we then need to develop if we're using a multimodal perspective. So kind of including how we collect data and in what form, and how we transcribe and analyze multimodal video recordings of interaction, for instance. So in that same project, we had some handheld video recordings of things that were happening in the playground. We also gave children the opportunity to video record for us. Sometimes they wore wearable cameras like GoPros. Sometimes we took aerial video footage, and we toyed with the idea of sort of GPS trackers and things like that as well. So that then all sort of provides rich multimodal data that you need to think about how we're going to analyze it. How does the theory then translate into the sort of methods of data collection and analysis? And that sort of changes in light of these changing contexts and means of data collection. Sometimes multimodality is criticised for being overly sort of micro in focus. So it is often, especially like the analysis that I was talking about of the clapping games, they were very, it was quite fine-grained, systematic, really looking closely at quite small moments of data, small clips from the playground, because it involves often looking at modes individually and separately, and then thinking about their role together in a whole. So it is time-consuming. And that means that, just a small extract of video can be very layered and complex when you look at it through that lens. And I think that's an advantage of the approach. It gives you depth and really tries to look at what might not immediately be noticeable in a text or an interaction, and gives you tools for sort of looking closely. But it does mean that it's time consuming and it's not suitable for large sections of data. So it does have its limitations. And I think it's perfectly, reasonable to be open and clear and reflective about that. So it has been also kind of suggested that multimodal approaches can risk losing sight of context through focusing overly on those sort of small moments or artifacts or instances in isolation. But I think like with all theories and methods, it's about knowing the reach and limitations of particular perspectives, and potentially then combining theories and methods to kind of compensate for those issues, but always being aware of the lenses that we adopt and that they're always going to give us kind of partial perspectives. I think in my own work, I would say I've done this kind of by applying multimodality to underexplored areas and kind of using some of its core principles, but developing or expanding on those through looking in the context that I'm working in. So for me, that kind of involved identifying an area of focus that hadn't been extensively viewed multimodally before. So that in my case, kind of children's play, but that warranted that lens because it did have these sort of multimodal characteristics. It's very physical, embodied, gestural, it makes use of all sorts of different materials and resources. And it has, central importance in children's lives and implications for fields like education. So that was sort of the rationale, I suppose, behind looking at it in that way. But I guess I've also been interested in innovating methods underpinned by multimodality, and that in part has been driven by sort of technological developments. So as new tools are available to help us collect multimodal data, like video cameras of various kinds, GoPros, GPS systems, screen capture, video calls, all sorts, that kind of calls for new developments in how we might analyse such data to account for multiple modes. And that's where I'd say I've sort of really tried to build on some of the concepts of multimodality and think about how we can develop tools for it. And I think kind of practically and more generally, it's kind of about identifying a question or an issue or a need, then thinking about the limits and reach of existing theory and kind of thinking creatively about what new concepts might be needed. But I think always also bearing in mind that we need to be wary of overgeneralizing or oversimplifying. So it might be helpful to sort of, if you're developing a new theory, to sort of think about testing it on several different cases or in several different contexts. And also kind of opening new theories up to others for critique and commentary, because I think it's really vital to get multiple perspectives and identify issues that you may not have seen as relevant, but making them part of the considerations. I think it's important to kind of always reflect on the scope and the reach of every theory and approach. And there's been quite a bit written, for instance, about whether multimodality and ethnography are complementary or contradictory. So ethnography is often about trying to get sort of deep immersion in a culture and interpreting that cultural group, and it's often involving very prolonged time in the field and in-depth in situ field work, whereas multimodality can sometimes focus on just a few small moments of interaction because of its depth and its detail, or just a small number of artifacts. So some have argued that they're kind of epistemologically incompatible because of this scale of focus and the risk of multimodality losing context. But then others have sort of flipped that around and said that actually their differences are kind of productively complementary, because ethnographic perspectives can offer that really important insight into the wider social context that multimodality on its own might not. Whereas multimodality, really helps us to zoom in on those tiny moments that might get overlooked in an ethnography because you've got so much to take in. So multimodality then kind of supports that depth of insight into situated moments of meaning making in multiple forms. So I think that the debates and the tensions are sort of actually a really interesting area of research to look at, and there will be different perspectives on it, and there will be arguments sort of for and against. But that's one example, I suppose, of actual kind of productive difference when theories might be put in, when theories and methods can be put into combination. My research is often driven by changes in the social context, and digital technologies have been central to that in several ways. So partly in terms of the increasing prominence of digital tools and digital media in children's lives, that kind of is necessitating research that examines the consequences of that, the discontinuities and continuities from earlier practices, the changes, and so on. But it's also making new forms of data and data collection possible and accessible. So again, that's sort of necessitating change in terms of the tools and methods we might need. So I suppose for me, I'm kind of thinking that the wider social context drives developments in theory sometimes and research, and that new research questions arise because of that. So for me, that novelty in research is kind of driven by that pressing need to understand the changing social world and finding or developing or adapting theories and methods for that. I think it's a good question. I think theory can become quite abstract very easily. So I think I found that providing real world examples is often really valuable. So when I'm introducing students and teachers to the concept of multimodality, I'll often start with a really general question about, what kinds of text have you read or written today? And examples of things like social media and emails and websites and so on often come up. And then that's a sort of way into thinking about the kind of characteristics of the text that they're reading and creating. And we can highlight from that, so much of communication is now multimodal because it's not just written, it also includes emojis and video and sound and so on. And I also often kind of try and do walkthroughs of multimodal analysis with students and teachers. So looking at things like picture books or a comparison of two adverts, and providing a sort of a scaffold to systematically look at modes in turn. So taking time to look at what the image is doing, look at what the writing is doing, what the gaze is doing, and so on, to think about how each is contributing to the overall meaning within a whole. And I think those practical examples can kind of help to highlight that concept that language is just one part of communication and that all modes have different affordances that we need to acknowledge. I think the examples, the real world examples, are helpful for that. And then I think as well, anchoring theory to current issues and debates or misconceptions is really helpful. So for instance, most of us are kind of aware of the increasingly central role of digital technologies in many children's lives. And often I think people are recognizing that existing theories or approaches may not be sufficient for dealing with this change. So sometimes this is quite a practical need, like a student might want to analyze a TV advert, but they'll find that the sort of language-based analytical tools that are out there aren't going to account for features like moving image and music and sound effects and so on. Or similarly, a teacher might want to assess films produced by children and young people, but they might find that the existing grading structures designed for written assessments are just not adequate. They're not going to take account for those other features. So I think it's sort of, it's helpful to sort of tap into what people know, but they might not know it in these terms or in this sort of framing. And that's where theory can sort of help to make sense of these things these changes that are happening. And I think theories like multimodality as well, they can kind of offer a way of recognizing and understanding and responding to changes like this. And multimodality also isn't just about kind of critiquing the status quo. It's not just about dismantling it and sort of unpacking it in ways that some other approaches, I'm thinking of sort of discourse analysis, would approach a text. It's kind of also about recognizing changing meaning-making practices and thinking productively then about the kinds of curriculum and pedagogies and educational environments that are sort of demanded by that shift in focus. So in that way, I think it's quite a productive and powerful theory. It's more than kind of abstract navel gazing. It's really about broadening what gets recognized as meaning making and recognizing the capacities of children who might otherwise be sort of marginalized really for not communicating in traditional forms. And so it's about kind of prompting educational change. And so I think that can sometimes be powerful too, if we can explain about why a theory is valuable or necessary or relevant. That can be really powerful, as much as sort of explaining the theory itself.